I don't know what my least favorite song in all the world is, but I do know that one of them is The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. There are few songs that make me want to take a drill right through my ears, but that is one of them. And you need to know the reason for that is that song came out in 1976, and I hate to admit it, but I was a little boy when that song came out, and I heard that song that just seemed like it would never end over and over and over until I hear it today, and the first thing I'm looking for is that cordless drill. Put me out of my misery. But the story behind The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is actually, and I know how many of you right now, that horrible melody is just going through your brain right now, going, shame on you, Pastor, for tormenting me, because it's going right through mine right now. But the song was about a shipwreck in 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was one of the largest tanker ships built for travel on the Great Lakes. And its ordinary route was from Duluth, Minnesota, to Detroit, Toledo, and some of the other great Rust Belt cities that dotted the shores of the Great Lakes. It would take iron ore down to these manufacturing centers to be processed and turned into our cars and steel products, whatever else. But on this one night in November, November 10th, it started in the afternoon. It wasn't a night storm. It was kind of during the day. Winds beat up on Lake Superior, and the ship kind of had a couple of just devastating errors. Its radar went down, and its ability to communicate was kind of lost. And then it turns out that as it was heading for some safe harbors, some of them, either the lighthouse wasn't working or the radar beacons weren't working. And so as much as it tried to find a safe place, it kept on being exposed to the wind and to the waves. And so suddenly, somewhere about 7:30 in the evening of November 10th, it suddenly and catastrophically was lost. And it was a reminder of just how precarious and oftentimes how frightening life on water could be. It's largely lost to us today because so much of our travel is done, if it's any length of place, it's done by air. And so we have fears of our own of air travel, but largely lost to us was the mysteries, the power, the fear of water travel. And yet for human history, so much, almost all of us in this room have ancestors that made their way here, not on an airplane, but on a boat. And ours, since we're here, obviously survived. But the fears of travel over sea cannot be underestimated. I was looking around this week at some examples to give to you, and one of the great fishing cities in the United States is Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's not that big of a place. It's about 30,000 people. But it was founded in about 1623. Old, for United States standards, old city. And from its earliest days, apparently, the soil where Gloucester is located is pretty bad for agriculture. In fact, for a while, they abandoned the original settlement to move further inland because they wanted better farming. And as it turns out, through the centuries, Gloucester, up until even now, if you go to the grocery store, you go to the freezer section, you grab frozen fish, such as it is, you're inevitably going to find Gordon's. It's the Gordon's Company out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. It is the location for the movie in the early 90s of The Perfect Storm. I guess 2000 was when the movie came out. But that being said, it's a historic American fishing town. And their records indicate that since the founding of the village in the 1600s, more than 10,000 men, mostly men, died at sea. They keep within their town hall a mural, a wall of names dating to the mid-1800s of every shipwreck and every crew member who has perished while they were out at sea. The latest being, as far as I could tell, the last time they had a shipwreck that resulted in deaths was 1994, and they lost all the sailors on board. There were 4 of them, and they all died at sea. Again, one small fishing village out of thousands at one point. I was reading about a year ago a book on whaling, because why wouldn't I, right? So I'm reading this book on whaling, and sometimes we just lose sight of what and how people lived. So I want you to imagine what whaling was like. You'd get a big boat with a lot of men on it, and they'd go out to sea looking for whales. Now, at first, you didn't have to go far to find a whale. They were plentiful, because especially until they invented the harpoon that was launched through gunpowder, the whale had a better chance than you did of surviving. So there were whales all over the place, but the more they were hunted, and they were hunted mostly for their oil, the way we would light our homes, the way we would light our streets in our towns, all of that required. It requires a lot of petroleum today. It required a lot of oil back then. So the need for whales, for their oil, for their bones were used and carved for ornamentation, for women's jewelry. Every part of the whale was used, but there was an endless need, a demand. And so there was, as long as there's demand, there are people willing to go out and find the supply. And so they would load up in these big boats. But you couldn't get a whale from the big boat. Instead, as soon as they discovered a whale, they'd get as close as they could. Then they'd put men in a rowboat with oars, about 14, 12 of them, and they'd do all the sweat equity of getting as close as they could to this whale, and then the fun began. They would get as close as they could to this whale. They would take this harpoon, again, this was before they were able to deliver it with a gunpowder. They would throw this harpoon and hope to hit the whale, but once they hit the whale, you think a roller coaster's fun? They would hit that whale, and that whale would do everything in its power to get away from that harpoon and from you. They would try to dive deep. They would try to drive out. But the whole point is, they're in this little boat with this big whale going as fast as that whale can, as far as that whale can. And it didn't always end in success. And that was the livelihood. Nantucket Island, before it became a playground for billionaires, it was a whaling community. The losses of life through the sea, through our industry, through our accidents and our travel. We've already seen earlier, when peace like a river attendeth my soul, the first hymn that we looked at, It Is Well With My Soul, was written by a man who lost children to a ship accident at sea. When we looked at Amazing Grace, it wasn't written about the ocean, but it was written by a man who spent most of his life on the sea. It was reported that in the 1840s in England, an Anglican hymn book had about 40 pages of hymns solely dedicated to hymns written about the sea. It was a place of anxiety and fear, and everyone knew that the calmest seas could turn into the worst storm at a moment's notice. Everyone knew that as much as technology was increasing by the 1800s, and we were moving from wood to iron, we were moving from sails to engines, there was still that precariousness of not knowing what would happen. And it is, I think, unique to people that have been at sea, something I certainly haven't. The solitude, the loneliness, the tininess of finding yourself far enough from shore where you are just this tiny little speck in this immense, vast desert of water. And so it is that this hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, was the original lyrics written in the 1869 were all about the sea. And even though we've associated this hymn with military, for good reasons, the fact remains that the origins of this hymn are embedded in the sea. The original lyrics to the 1869 version that we will sing at the conclusion includes that it's every line ends, protect us from the sea. Save us from those in peril on the sea. It was later, there were two other versions updated in the 1940s. The writer of this hymn, William Whiting, was an Anglican priest, and so they control the copyright on it. 1940s, they changed it to sort of the version our choir sang. The beginning of it is Almighty God, strong to save, and then it's save us from the sea, the land. And in 1982, they amended it again to say space, to include all those places where human beings in our ingenuity found ourselves exploring and risking life and limb in order for us to either get more resources or to understand our world and our universe a bit better. And so this hymn has been adapted multiple times in its existence to cover the idea of exploration and the risks attendant with that. And in the military use, the obvious, which was to cover the depths in which men and women would put themselves at risk as they would serve their nations. This is a hymn that's not only been used by the United States military, particularly the U.S. Naval Academy has adopted this hymn, but it's also been used by the Royal Navies, the Royal Army, the Marines. Our Marines use this, our Navy uses it, the Coast Guard has this as an official part because they spend so much of their time, obviously, on the sea. But at its heart, what this hymn represents is a cry to God to protect us from those places in which we find ourselves afraid, alone, and at risk. For those places in life where we find that we come up against how small we truly are. I just read in the news this morning about a man in California who had a pregnant wife, and his body was discovered on a glacier, Darwin's Glacier, somewhere up, I believe, northern Sequoia National Park. Turns out from the little I was able to get from the article that he had just recently gone out to a sporting goods store and bought mountaineering gear. And he had the helmet and the crampons and the axes and all that stuff. But what it's probably going to turn out is he had a lot of gear, but not a lot of knowledge. Even with people of great knowledge, the fact remains that when we get ourselves out of our comfort zones, and in our modern technologically controlled world, our comfort zone is pretty big. But when we find ourselves in places where nature reminds us of its power, it could be floods. Many of us have experienced floods. One of the towns I served as an intern pastor 20 years ago, Dallsville, New York, was in the headlines this week. The rivers, Canada Creek they call it, it's about the size of a river, went over its banks and went through the town and destroyed, covered basements and first floors. The part of this city for a while literally became the banks of this river. Every now and then we're reminded of how finite we can be. The world around us doesn't give us much margin for error. I'm sure this man who died on this glacier thought he was well protected. I'm sure he had the latest and the best gear that was out there. But he was 40 years old, unless you have spent years, and even then, if you've spent decades on walking on glaciers and dealing with glaciers, you know just what great risks are involved in exploring something like that. To do that on your own, you can do it, but you can never do it safely. There's always huge risks because it doesn't take much for the world to hurt us. In the physical sense, but also, again, while we might protect ourselves with the use of technology, every one of us are walking wounded when it comes to those emotional, physical, and spiritual scars. We're told that there's an interesting thing about what psalm this hymn was based on. Some argue that it was Psalm 121 that was read this morning, which is referred to as a psalm of ascent, a psalm of pilgrimage. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? It comes from Yahweh. It comes from my God, who will keep me safe in the midst of the risks and the dangers inherent in life. Now, the second place that it comes, I found a couple sources that said that it came from Psalm 107. Psalm 107, verses 23 through 25, have this particular about the ocean. It says, "Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea." Now, in the end, scholars are going to argue with one another. I'll just step back and watch them go. But both Psalms provide us some deeper wisdom to the point and the purpose of hymns like this. Psalm 107 reminds us of the risks inherent in water, risks that go back to the time of Noah and the flood. But Psalm 121 I find more ubiquitous and more helpful to us, because Psalm 121, I think, is why, as I listen to this hymn, it's always been one of my favorites. Not only does it have a beautiful, powerful melody that was written by someone else, by the way, but not only does it have a beautiful, powerful melody, but the lyrics themselves cry out to any of us who have found ourselves adrift in life. It doesn't have to literally be on the sea. Anytime we find ourselves with a world or people in the world are proving that they are quite capable of wounding us to our core, we are reminded of a God who has promised to always be our Redeemer, always be our rescuer. The name for the tune is called Melita. It's a derivation of the word Malta. The guy that wrote the tune for this song based it on Paul's shipwreck on the island of Malta that we read of a few months ago in the book of Acts. It was to conjure in our imaginations that parallel between this hymn and Paul's sacrifice, his journey, his life. Paul is a man that surrendered everything to Jesus Christ. As Paul says, so that he might endure, the greatest battle that Paul fought wasn't the world, it was his own being, his own sense of place and purpose. And ultimately, the one thing Paul wanted more than anything else was to be a faithful servant. He tells us again and again how unfaithful he was, and that's something where we can all relate. We all can relate to Paul in being unfaithful to God. We can all relate to Paul as to hurting other people. Where we need to be remembering and recalling ourselves is the call of Paul for all of us who find ourselves outside of the will of God to come inside the will of God, to do what we need to do, so that at the end of our journey, our shipwrecks, whatever might occur between now and eternity, that we have done something worthy of the love, the grace, and the mercy of Jesus Christ. And what we are assured of by the psalm, what we are assured of by Paul, what Eternal Father strong to save assures us is we might not be able to rescue our lives, but God will stand firm to redeem us at all points. There will never be a time where God is not with us, present with us, redeeming and delivering us. Eternal Father, strong to save, is the basis of our prayer life. Crying out to God in the midst of the dangers of your life and my life today, here on dry land. Rescue me. I don't know what today will bring. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But the one thing I do know is you are my refuge. And to you, in good days and in my worst days, I will turn for help. Amen.